Hi there and welcome to Power Play. I'm Vashi Kapelos in Ottawa on this Tuesday night. This evening, all about that bridge.
This is a great example of cooperation between our countries.
The U.S. should own at least half of the bridge.
U.S. President Donald Trump threatens to block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge connecting Windsor and Detroit. It's a move that could have serious economic consequences for both countries, to say the least. We're going to go one-on-one with former Michigan Governor Rick Snyder, a Republican who helped broker the deal with Canada to build that bridge. That conversation is coming up. Then, staving off an election.
Have you signed any type of formal agreement with the Conservatives to avoid an election?
No, there's no formal deal. What's happening is what our leader, Pierre Poilievre, committed to right after the election.
Is there a deal to avoid an election? And what do pledges from both the government and opposition to work together really mean? I'm going to ask Conservative House Leader Andrew Scheer in moments. Plus, our front bench is coming up to weigh in on both stories. Dan Moulton, Larissa Waller, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone will be with us a little bit later on in the program. First, though.
I explained that Canada, of course, paid for the construction of the bridge, over $4 billion, that the ownership is shared between the state of Michigan and the government of Canada, and that in the construction of the bridge, obviously there's Canadian steel, Canadian workers, but also U.S. steel, U.S. workers that are involved. This is a great example of cooperation between our countries. Look forward to it opening.
Another day, another threat from the President of the United States. Donald Trump says he will block the opening of what is poised to become the newest border crossing between Canada and the U.S., a move which could have major economic impacts for both countries if it materializes. In a lengthy post on Truth Social last night in which he named several trade irritants, Trump threatened to shut down plans to open the Gordie Howe International Bridge, which connects Ontario to Michigan. He claims he won't allow it to open until Washington is fully compensated for everything he claims it has given to Ottawa. Trump says the U.S. should own at least half the project, and negotiations will start immediately. It's worth pointing out Canada funded the project, and there is an agreement with Michigan to share toll revenue from the bridge once our costs are recouped. Trump's threats in the aggregate led to a new vibe this year in the House of Commons, with the government and Conservatives pledging to work together. Does that mean there's no election in the offing? Andrew Scheer is the Conservatives House Leader. Hi, Mr. Scheer. Good to welcome you back to studio. Thanks for making the time. I appreciate you making it. I want to start off and just ask point blank, is there some sort of formal deal between yourself and the government House Leader to avoid an election?
No, there's no formal deal. What's happening is what our leader, Pierre Poilievre, committed to right after the election. After 10 years of Liberal government, costs are out of control, crime is out of control, inflationary deficits have pushed up the cost of virtually everything, and criminals run free in our streets because of Liberal easy bail. We said right from the get-go, if the Liberals want to address these areas that we've been fighting for the past few years, we would allow legislation to pass that at the very least did no further harm. Or if in the case of what Mark Carney claims he needs to get results, we'll say, well, let's see if his approach will work. So, for example, we would prefer to see changes on bail that actually take away the principle of least restraint so that repeat offenders don't get bail almost automatically. They've got a different approach. We'll see which one, we'll see if their approach actually works.
But that means that, do I essentially interpret from that on the bail reform bill, I believe it's already made its way through the committee study, you won't stand in the way? That's right.
As we said, this is not what Canada needs. This does not undo the bad Liberal legislation that caused the problem. But it does no further harm. It won't make the system worse. So Mark Carney claims this will lead to a reduction in crime. Let's see what happens. So that's up, I believe, this Friday. We've made a commitment to allow that legislation to pass. We've had major concerns with the Budget Implementation Act. They wrote some powers in there that gave ministers the ability to completely ignore, bypass, circumvent laws and regulations. We know what happens when Liberals think nobody's watching. They've have a long track record of corruption, lining the pockets of their wealthy insider friends. We're calling attention to that, saying we need to see some movement on that. We need to put in some better safeguards, and that's been the nature of our conversations.
So the way you describe it feels very different to me. Even if the government has now signaled a willingness, for example, to change the budget implementation bill, that stuff wasn't happening. And they would characterize, your side as being obstructionist prior to Christmas as well. So what tangibly is leading to the change behind the scenes, and is it about avoiding an election?
Well, what I would say is that our approach hasn't really changed. Back in the fall, we were willing to park our differences on, for example, C9, the religious censorship bill. It's very, the committee is very divided on it. The Canadians are very divided on it. We're on the side of freedom of speech, and we're on the side of religious institutions that see this as a massive overreach. But it's clear that we're not going to find agreement on that particular clause. So we said, let's park that, and let's pass the bail reform bill, the Liberal attempt. We tried 19 times to unblock the committee. The Liberals chose to keep C9 virtually obstructing their own bill. It was only the 20th time that they finally agreed with us after the Christmas recess. So I'm hopeful that this is a change in approach on the government side, but we have been very consistent. Where there is no further harm done to the Canadian economy, even if we think our plan would be better, our tax cuts, our approach to cutting taxes to bring down prices, our approach to returning to balanced budgets to stop inflation, we believe that's a better approach. But we will allow Liberal legislation, we'll allow the government's legislation to pass if they work with us and if they accept our compromises. For example, to strengthen the accountability provisions of the Budget Implementation Act.
I have some questions about the actual legislation in a moment, but I just want to revisit the overall framing of it, because I take your point on some of what you're saying about your own party's actions prior to Christmas. I think, like I said, the Liberals would contend that wasn't the case all the time. They would label some of the behavior, as governments often do of the opposition, as obstructionist. Is this, again, I'll ask, is this because you're are you doing this now in the way that you are now, described in the way you do now, because you think you might lose an election?
Well, I believe you said it best. You said Liberals would characterize it that way, and they would, but that doesn't make it true. Go back to the beginning of this Parliament. Their very first piece of legislation, C2, had a whole bunch of provisions in there, everything from border controls to government gathering information. We said, hey, this is a big overreach. There's things we can agree with, measures to go after fentanyl trafficking, measures to strengthen our borders, but there's so much government overreach in here that we can't pass the bill as is. They came back to us with a new bill, C12, based on our suggestions. We allowed that to pass. Mark Carney claimed that he could get big projects built at unimaginable speeds with Bill C5. That was all the way back in the summer. We allowed that to pass. So what you've seen since the election is Conservatives recognizing that Canadians voted for this particular government with this particular dynamic in seats, a minority government. We said after 10 years of Liberal policies making life more unaffordable, more dangerous communities, we said we won't stand in the way of legislation that at least does no further harm, or maybe even where they've taken conservative ideas. We've been consistent on that since the last election.
But I think what the Liberals are talking about, and yes, some of it is characterized by them, but there's some objective evidence also of, for example, on C4, which was about ending the carbon tax, 3 days in the House, kind of slow walking it, 6 days at committee, 3 days in the third reading. Even C9 on hate crimes, right? I listened to some of the filibuster, and we've talked about this before. You had one of your MPs talking about a preference for dogs while his wife has a preference for cats. I think those tactics were certainly leading to the characterization of your party being obstructionist. You don't seem to be employing the same kinds of tactics in the way that you were prior to Christmas. Is that because you think you will lose an election, given public opinion polls?
Well, again, I just refuse to accept the premise that there's a change in posture. A few days of committee study on a bill that touched on many, C4 you mentioned, touched on several components. The changes to the carbon tax were already passed through Ways and Means motions. It was already in effect. So again, that's a pretty normal amount of time for legislation to be studied at committee. We passed bills like the free trade deal with the UK, some of those free trade deals that existed before Mark Carney even became Prime Minister. We've allowed those to pass. So I think if you go back to the last election, there are multiple examples regularly at various parts of the parliamentary session where legislation has been allowed to pass because, in our view, it either does no further harm, they've taken conservative ideas, or we say, well, this is Mark Carney's response. Let's see if it actually gets results. Because I think that's what Canadians really care about is, will their lives improve? Nothing that this government has done will actually lower prices. We don't believe the response to the bail crisis that they caused will fix the problem. But we will see if with these bills being allowed to pass, Canadians will be able to judge Mark Carney on his results, not just on his rhetoric. And I think you see that with C5. He promised that C5 would that he could move at unimaginable speeds. Where are we? almost mid-February, not a single new project has made it through that major projects office. So we're getting to the point where Canadians are going to see more and more about what Mark Carney's results are, not just what his good intentions or his grand rhetoric is all about.
And I do take your point on all of that. The one part of the question that you didn't answer, and I'll lay it out for you, is around, like, is your party just really hesitant to force an election because you think at this point you stand to lose it, given public opinion polling? Or is that part of the calculation, to be blunt?
The entire calculation is, after 10 years of Liberal policies that have made life less affordable, driven up prices, made our communities less safe, it's time for action. It's time to get results. If this is what Mark Carney claims will solve the problems in terms of his weak approach to bail reform, GST tax credit top-ups that won't actually lower prices at the grocery store,
but if
that
you
most
thought all
Canadians
that
don't
will
qualify
fail,
for.
why are you keeping them in power?
No, it's not about that at all. It's about showing Canadians that this is the government that they voted for. Let's see if those results actually come to fruition. We believe our policies, as we were saying for 10 years, we've been proven right. We've been proven right that easy bail causes surges in crime. That was a Liberal choice. We were right that the carbon tax drove up prices without combating climate change. We were right about a whole host of issues, massive deficits causing inflation. So we hope now that Canadians can start to see the results of Mark Carney's legislative program, and we believe that they will say, okay, well, not much has changed. Nothing's really gotten better in Canada since Mark Carney's become Prime Minister. Prices are still going up, job losses in the private sector, auto sector dwindling.
That's what I'm confused about. Pardon the interruption. Like, if you believe that will be the case and Canadians will no longer be better off, what other reason do you have for holding back on forcing an election other than your own political survival?
Well, I don't think Canadians would want a decision made on whether or not there's going to be an election based on partisan interests, one way or the other. We've been consistent since the last election. We respect the results of the last election. We respect that Mark Carney has the right to attempt to solve some of these problems that Liberals themselves caused. We also believe that it's better for voters to be informed about the actual results that come from that. And where there are aspects of legislation that we just cannot support, we're not supporting them. This clause in the Budget Implementation Act that allows ministers to ignore the law, we saw what Liberals did with the Green Slush Fund. They lined the pockets of their own donors, their own supporters. So we're not going to let that happen. If they accept our compromises and the bill then is more acceptable without that egregious workaround on transparency and parliamentary accountability, then we'll allow it to pass.
Have they given you the impression, and I ask because prior to Christmas we asked them a lot of times about this, I've asked Minister McKinnon himself, has he given you the impression that they are willing to compromise on that?
I would say that the conversations are, I believe the conversations are being held in good faith. I see, I find that the last few weeks of meetings that there's been some progress, and that we'll wait and see what actually happens in the end result, but I will say that it seems like the conversations are being held in good faith.
Okay, people watching this show are not going to understand what's going on. Mr. Scheer, thanks for making the time tonight.
Thank
I appreciate it
very
very much. Conservative House Leader Andrew Scheer. We'll take a quick break. After that break, U.S. President Donald Trump is vowing to block the opening of a new bridge between Ontario and Michigan. The governor who signed the deal with Canada, Rick Snyder, is coming up in just a bit. First, though, our front bench is here. Dan Moulton, Larissa Waller, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone. We're going to talk about what all of this means for the Prime Minister next. Stay right there.
This is a great example of cooperation between our countries. Look forward to it opening. The president asked appropriately that his ambassador, who's from Michigan, of course, play a role in smoothing the conversation in and around the bridge. So it was a positive conversation.
This negotiation is specific to the bridge. The new bridge, the Gordie Howe Bridge, is Canadian owned and operated. And there's a concern, a valid concern on the part of the president, that this bridge was allowed to be built.
Make no mistake about it, as sure as I'm talking to you, I'm very confident this bridge is going to open. I'll tell you the reason why it's going to open, because it's in the best interest of the American economy.
The Canadians have paid for the bridge. The bridge was built with organized labor, union labor on both sides of the bridge. It is important that it continue.
Reaction there from both sides of the border on the latest threat to Canada from Donald Trump. He's claiming he will block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge connecting Ontario and Michigan. Trump says the U.S. should own at least half of the $6.4 billion bridge and claims it has virtually no U.S. content. To be clear, Canada funded the construction of the bridge in its entirety, used American and Canadian labor and materials, and will recoup its costs through a toll. Once Canada's costs are recouped, there is a deal with Michigan to share in the toll revenues 50-50. So what now? Let's bring in our front bench. Former senior advisor to the Liberal Ontario governments of Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne, Dan Moulton is here in studio. He's now a partner with Crestview Strategy. Larissa Waller is the founder of Hanley Strategies. She's a former head of communications for Ontario's Conservative Premier, Doug Ford. Kathleen Monk, also in studio, is former director of communications to the late Jack Layton. She is now the principal owner of Monk & Associates. And Laura Stone rounds us out tonight. She's a Queen's Park reporter for the Globe and Mail. Hi, everybody.
Hey there.
Nice to see you, Dan. I'll start with you. There's just so many obviously false things about the way in which Trump is positioning this, from a lack of American involvement to costs that they might be out. Like, none of it is true. Let's be blunt. So why do you think, and I know it's hard to discern, but like, what do you think is really going on here?
Well, I think a couple of things are going on. One, this is going to be a preview of our experience over the course of the next year as we head into the USMCA renegotiations, where the president's going to find any particular grievance he can to claim that the U.S. is a victim of Canada and that we've been taking advantage of them and we have to do something about this really one-sided relationship. And he's been doing that for a year. He's going to do it for the next year and the years ahead. And we have to kind of get used to expecting these late-night tweets of the thing that's most recently grabbed his attention. I think in this case, the owners and operators of the Ambassador Bridge have for a long time been opposed to the development of the Gordie Howe Bridge and have fought it since its inception and pretty much every step of the way. They've clearly gotten the ear of the president on this one, and he made this foray last night. What I will say is I think what Canadians saw from Mark Carney today is exactly what they want from him, right? Which is a pretty calm demeanor about it, a commitment to continuing to have conversations with the president, an update on the conversations he had with the president, and an indication that we're going to find a resolution here. Because as you laid out there very bluntly, all of this that the president has put out there is factually incorrect. It's easily disputable. And hopefully it'll be easy for us to find a resolution and get the bridge open in the way that Premier Ford indicated it would be today.
It feels, Kathleen, in just the way that he looped in with all the others, with the bridge stuff, you know, China, Ontario liquor, a whole host of dairy, you know, it had very, like, you know, vibes from 8 months ago or something, when everything was about sort of a negotiating strategy in a way. Do you think that's what this is?
Well, ultimately, I think it's what Dan just spoke about. It's Trump's plan to constantly do payola policy. Like, you pay to Trump, you fundraise for Trump, which this owner of the bridge has, and you get the policy. It's the concierge for corporate USA. Like, that's what Trump does. And that's what he's doing here. And what I was impressed by today, actually, though, was the speed at which Canadian elected officials, whether it was Premier Ford or Carney or others, you know, moved out with the same talking points and really quickly. And even you saw the governor there as well in that clip you just played. She also, you know, touted the same talking points. We're talking shared labor, right? Concrete from both sides, steel from both sides, paid for by Canada. It's a government to government, actually, you know, shared project. And more than that, Ford went even a little bit further and actually laid out the electoral consequences, citing that there are midterms coming up where there are 13 different Republicans or 13 different seats up for grabs, 7 of which are Republicans, that are at risk if this bridge doesn't go forward with. You know, we've seen the Ambassador Bridge in the past shut down. It did during the Freedom Convoy in 2022. We need this bridge to move people, trade, traffic, all that stuff. And that's why it's going to be successful no matter how much Trump and his payola policy of you pay and you get the policy you want is going to do, because Americans and Canadians on both sides of the border recognize that this is needed.
Well, even in 2017, so did Donald Trump.
That's right.
Ironically,
he
right?
Fast-tracked it, yeah.
Kathleen's point, I think, Larissa, is well taken on the way in which governments of all levels and elected officials actually address this today. And I will point out, like, it hasn't been the case always that we can get ministers to stop, or in particular the prime minister to stop, and not dismiss the question about Trump as an irrelevant one. He didn't do that today. He spoke pretty directly about the call that had happened with the president to, like what Kathleen said, Premier Ford spoke out as well. We had a bunch of ministers who engaged on the subject as well. I get it. The talking points have the benefit in this case of being true. But what do you think of that approach? And do you think ultimately it's a good one to take versus, you know, trying to avoid talking about it?
You know, I commend the Prime Minister and his tone. He really struck the right tone here, where he wasn't dismissive. He wasn't even rude towards the president. He said, you know, he rightly wants the American ambassador, who's from Michigan, to be part of smoothing the path forward. I mean, what he was probably thinking is what all of us are thinking, is that this is ludicrous. The facts are not on the president's side, and the president would know that, given that he fast-tracked this project in 2017 while he was the president, and he knows how important the Windsor-Detroit crossing is to both economies. In Canada, 25% of all truck traffic comes through that corridor. We need increased capacity, and the Premier of Ontario was right to point out that it's the U.S. economy that will suffer, in addition to the Canadian economy, should that bridge not go forward. The Prime Minister, I think, wanted to probably say what he really thought, but he restrained himself, and I commend him for that. But it doesn't matter what the facts are. The president will tweet out anything, right? The truth does not matter. And so when rational people need to speak to that, because rational people run the provinces and the country and the other states, but they have to respond to this crazy person who has a phone and unfettered access to Truth Social. It's hard to strike that tone of, I'm the adult in the room, I'm not going to be disrespectful, I'm not going to be dismissive, but I have to let the people know that this is in fact crazy.
Yeah, Laura, I think you were there for Premier Ford's comments. What's your thoughts on the way in which sort of the Premier and Prime Minister and other politicians are approaching this?
I think the tone was notable. I mean, they tried to keep things calm. They didn't ratchet up the rhetoric, but they did address this issue head on. And I think, you know, at times politicians are tired, quite frankly, as is the Canadian public, to have to respond to every single thing that President Trump says, particularly about Canada. And we've seen kind of the fatigue on the part of the Prime Minister at times to even talk about this. I think it was important that he stopped, even if it was brief. It was only a couple of minutes, but I think it probably did reassure a lot of people that he had spoken to President Trump and is trying to maintain a calm and measured tone when it comes to this. You know, Premier Ford has really stood his ground when it comes to dealing with the Trump administration. That's probably what he believes that his constituents in Ontario want to hear. And he did say today that one of the grievances from the president in that post was about removing the U.S. alcohol from the LCBO shelves. And Premier Ford said that he's not going to do that, and he thinks Canada should stand its ground and shouldn't buckle over to President Trump. And that's probably a pretty popular message. It's a fine line, though, because we've seen that backfire in some instances when it comes to the negotiations. But overall, I mean, I think the Prime Minister addressed it briefly, that this is probably all tied into the USMCA, the renegotiation or the review of the trade agreement, and the president setting that up. So I think everyone kind of has to take a breath and take it all with a grain of salt, but it is important to address it and to be transparent with the public.
Okay, I'll leave this part of our conversation there. I'll take a quick commercial break. On the other end of that break, all of a sudden, everyone on Parliament Hill wants to cooperate and collaborate. What the heck is in the water? Our front bench is back on that next.
Any type of formal agreement with the Conservatives to avoid an election?
No, there's no formal deal. What's happening is what our leader, Pierre Poilievre, committed to right after the election. After 10 years of Liberal government, costs are out of control, crime is out of control, inflationary deficits have pushed up the cost of virtually everything, and criminals run free in our streets because of Liberal easy bail. We said right from the get-go, if the Liberals want to address these areas that we've been fighting for the past few years, we would allow legislation to pass that at the very least did no further harm.
When you get 13 premiers in a room, politics comes up. And politics of every type comes up. That came up. That's going to be up to the Prime Minister. It's going to be up to the people to decide. If they do decide to call an election, has nothing to do with me.
Care Poilievre reached out at all again for advice, or have you been chatting to him at all?
No, not at all. But that's all right. The people are going to decide at the end of the day.
Reaction there to the possibility of an election anytime soon. As you heard earlier from Conservative House Leader Andrew Scheer, both Liberals and Conservatives are going out of their way, all of a sudden it appears, to avoid one. What's going on? Let's bring back our front bench. Dan Moulton, Larissa Waller, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone. Laura, I'll start with you because we could hear your lovely voice asking about all the conversations that are not happening between Pierre Poilievre and Doug Ford. I have to say, like, I just interviewed Andrew Scheer not too long ago. I was, like, blown away at how different it was than many previous interviews in, like, the tone in particular he was taking to the subject of collaboration. Like, what do you think is going on?
I think it's pretty obvious that the Conservatives don't want an election, and neither do the Liberals, quite frankly, it seems at this point in time. But I don't think it's as kind of benevolent or altruistic as both sides are making it out to seem. I mean, the Conservatives seem to be giving the government space, and I believe they're choosing to do so because they believe that Mr. Carney will fail or in their view, you know, continue to let Canadians down, but they need time to do that, right? I mean, Pierre Poilievre just came off of his leadership review. He was obviously focused on winning that by a large majority, which he did. But, you know, the polls don't look good for Mr. Poilievre, at least on a personal level right now. You know, Mr. Carney, while he seems to be doing well in public opinion polling, I mean, it's still a huge risk to go to the public. You need a compelling reason in order to call an election. And he has portrayed himself as a serious person at a very important time, and to sort of put that on pause at a very difficult moment for Canada to head to the polls. I think that could be a tough sell, although we've seen it before with prime example, Doug Ford. And you could see there that, you know, he clearly talked about this among the other premiers as we reported with the prime minister. So I think that everyone has their own best interests at heart here, and they don't believe that now is the best time for either of them to go to an election. We'll see if the Liberals end up changing their minds, though, because we at least know that it's being discussed at the highest levels of power in this country.
I do find it interesting that they've arrived at this consensus view now, Larissa, because a lot of the same conditions existed before Christmas when they weren't taking this view, right? Like, the polling was still not great for the leader of the Conservative Party. The Liberals still needed a reason to go to the electorate, but they were much more, everyone tells me behind the scenes, pro the prospect of an election than they are now. What do you think has tangibly changed between then and now?
I don't think much has changed, and we'll remember after the last federal election, Pierre Poilievre paraphrased an Abraham Lincoln quote that I will stand with a man when he's right, I will part with him when he's wrong. There isn't anything glaringly wrong that the Conservatives could say, convince the public that they have to force an election. And let's be honest here, it's really the government that has to decide to go to an election. The Conservatives can't really force the government to go to an election. If I was a Liberal strategist, I'd want to go before the NDP sort of rose from the ashes, right? The way electoral math and election math works is that the Liberals have a much greater chance of winning a majority or doing well in an election if there's nobody on their left flank. And that's what happened in the last election. That's how election math worked in Mark Carney's favor and against Pierre Poilievre. That election math would likely work again if the NDP hasn't sort of figured out, you know, where they stand on a bunch of things and elect a new leader. So if I was a Liberal, I would say go now. But the Conservatives rightly are reading the room and saying and thinking it's not what the public wants. And I actually think Mark Carney, who isn't a hyper-partisan, is more likely to want to solve the nation's problems than benefit politically. So he's probably fighting with his party leadership on that one.
What do you think's going on, Kathleen?
Well, we can talk about the election speculation and why no one wants an election right now. We did that on Question Period on your show on Sunday. But I would actually want to address something else. Listen, cooperation is not a bad thing. It should happen. That's why people elect minority governments, because they want people to work together. But it is the hypocrisy right now of the Conservatives that is killing me. Because for literally 3 years, they railed against New Democrats who had a transparent, very clear, cooperative deal that delivered tangible results for Canadians. And they said that that was, the worst thing that could ever happen to Canadians, that there was some kind of, evil coalition that was happening. And now the Conservatives are literally plotting in rooms with the Prime Minister some kind of cooperation, and it's fine now. So it's the hypocrisy that kills me. I think parties should cooperate. I think they should work to get Parliament and legislation through. But right now, when I see Mr. Scheer or when I see, Mr. Poilievre in those meetings, basically trying desperately to avoid an election. And I appreciate Larissa's very strong communication skills in trying to spin it about the Liberals. But I'm sorry, it's the Conservatives that don't want an election right now. And truthfully, New Democrats don't want an election right now because, newsflash, we don't have a leader. But, the reality is that, the Liberals are in the best position to actually secure a majority. And frankly, if they went to an election and the Conservatives lost again, which would be their fourth, fifth loss in a row, Pierre Poilievre as leader would not be able to stand anymore. And that would mean the fragmentation of that coalition, very strong coalition that he himself, as Conservative leader, has built.
It is interesting, though, that what the Conservatives did find very unpalatable previously, right? Because of, I think, a number of reasons, but primarily like their politics being different than the Prime Minister at the time and the leader of the NDP, is now palatable because the politics of the Conservatives and the Liberals are not as misaligned as they were under the last government. What are your thoughts on how this continues to evolve or unfold, Dan?
Well, certainly what we're seeing from the Conservatives is about the public opinion polling. We can't ignore that. I think all the rest of the panelists have talked about it at length. The public polling environment has shifted dramatically. The Conservatives do not want an election right now. Watching Andrew Scheer on your program, that is not a man who wants an election. It's very clear in everything he said there that there is no interest in going that route. What I do think this is also reflective of the long-promised tone shift in how Pierre Poilievre was going to approach Parliament and how he's going to approach his leadership. I think the Conservatives are looking to communicate a more constructive approach in amending and supporting, where appropriate, the government's agenda. I think they want to demonstrate to Canadians that they can get things done, that they can work with the government where they feel it's appropriate. And I think that's what is being communicated here, is a different kind of approach for Mr. Poilievre now that he's on the other side of his leadership review. Conservative strategists have been talking about this for quite some time, and I think we're starting to see it in action. It is undermined, however, by the public opinion polling, because in this environment in which the Conservatives do look very weak in the minds of Canadians, and if there was an election, Kathleen's right, the Liberals would almost certainly win a majority, it doesn't exactly support moments like the one where you've got Andrew Scheer here and he's trying to explain why they're doing this in any other context than trying to avoid an election.
Laura, what do you think about it? I totally take the point that Dan's making. And I take the public opinion polling. And I will point out it's varied, right? You've got something like Leger, which shows a big gap between the Liberals and the Conservatives. You have Nanos and Angus Reid, for example, which shows a much smaller gap. But it's the first time in the past few weeks that we've seen any of the pollsters kind of head towards a trend line of a bigger gap. What are your thoughts on the way that might be informing this? And also, I don't know if it's a guarantee that, like you said, it's a risk, right? They may think a majority is in sight, the Liberals, but there's no guarantee of that. I recall covering a few previous elections in 2019 and 2021 when that was supposed to materialize and didn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Elections are hard work. Things can change. Events happen during elections that can then fundamentally shift what they're about. And Mark Carney is a political neophyte, right? I'm not sure he gets his kicks from doing politics maybe in the way that Pierre Poilievre does. And Poilievre is an experienced campaigner. It obviously didn't go his way last time, but he was able to break through in some key areas in the GTA in Southern Ontario, for instance. So, I'm not sure that Mr. Carney is kind of licking his chops, hoping to get back on the huskings. That said, he will have to at some point eventually. But I just think this will take kind of a lot of planning and thought on the part of both parties, but certainly from the Liberals, if they are playing this. This is going to take a lot of work to kind of map out what this election is about, all the campaign stops, everything like that. This doesn't come together in an afternoon. So clearly conversations are happening, and they're even if they're casual, as we heard through our reporting through the premiers and others. But it's not something you would do in a split moment. And I'm not sure the polls are so definitive that Mark Carney would be absolutely handed a majority were an election to happen.
What do you think ultimately would prompt the rest of the Liberals to make that decision?
Oh, I think it will be convincing Mark Carney that this is his moment. And again, I don't think Mark Carney is a hyper-partisan who would want to seize that opportunity at this moment. What would have to convince him is just definitive polling, and things would have to calm down with the United States. I don't see either of those things happening. Mark Carney, to me, doesn't feel like somebody who's going to take a lot of risk and isn't going to go into something that he can't give 100% of his attention to. He's not somebody who seems to take on big projects like that off the side of his desk. And there's still a lot of trust to be built between, I think, Liberal Party leadership and the Prime Minister. Remember, he just became Liberal Party leader. So there's going to be a lot of convincing. I don't see that happening this spring, but I could be proven wrong.
Dan, what do you think ultimately? Like, is it necessarily that things with Trump calm down, or the converse that could provide the question to put to the electorate?
Well, I'll sort of put it back to you a different way. I think there's two things that could create there's circumstances for an election this spring, which I do agree is, I think, the least likely path forward. I think we're going to have a handful of by-elections in a few weeks, and that'll probably be the only elections that happen before the summer. But I think there are two things that could happen. One, you could have the domestic environment shift. You could have this constructive tone at Parliament be very short-lived, and Parliament could be presented as dysfunctional again by the government, and they could say, look, this isn't working for us. We've got to deal with a very problematic set of macroeconomic challenges, and we need a new mandate from Canadians, and the Prime Minister could request an election. That's one scenario. The other is external factors, in which Donald Trump and the USMCA negotiation creates such instability and so many problems for the government that the Prime Minister is actually in a position where he says, yeah, you know what, I have to go to an election in order to have a new mandate. And both of those circumstances, just to be clear, are underpinned by the fact that the public opinion polling is trending in one direction, which is very favorable for the governing party and the Liberals.
I got 30 seconds left. They're all yours, Kathleen.
Yeah, I would just say I think it's the rupture of the USMCA negotiations that would probably trigger an election if it was to happen, and that could be fall, or it could be in early 2027 post the Quebec election, provincial election, which is expected later this year.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Kathleen Monk, Dan Moulton, Larissa Waller, and Laura Stone, our wonderful front bench. We'll take a quick break. On the other end of that break, we're going to go one-on-one with the former governor of Michigan, Mr. Snyder, on the new threat from Governor Snyder, I should say, the new threat from Donald Trump to block the construction or the completion of the Gordie Howe Bridge. Back in a moment with that conversation.
We discussed the bridge. I explained that Canada, of course, paid for the construction of the bridge, over $4 billion, that the ownership is shared between the state of Michigan and the government of Canada, and that in the construction of the bridge, obviously there's Canadian steel, Canadian workers, but also U.S. steel, U.S. workers that are involved. This is a great example of cooperation between our countries. Look forward to it opening.
He also believes that the U.S. should own at least half of the bridge, have shared authority over what passes across it, and participate in the economic benefits generated by its use. This is just another example of President Trump putting America's interests first, and so he made that very clear in his call with Prime Minister Carney earlier today.
Welcome back to Power Play and coverage of our top story tonight. U.S. President Donald Trump threatening to block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge, which connects Ontario and Michigan, unless the United States is, quote, fully compensated for everything it has given Canada. A little bit of background. The bridge's construction was negotiated over decades, and a deal was signed in 2012 by Rick Snyder, Michigan's Republican governor at the time, and Stephen Harper, the Prime Minister here in Canada. That deal saw Canada agree to shoulder the cost of construction and was endorsed by the Trump Trump administration and Donald Trump himself back in 2017 during his first term in office. Former Governor Rick Snyder is with us live right now. Governor, a pleasure to welcome you to our program. Thank you very much for making the time.
It's great to be with you.
So given the fact that the president had in 2017 endorsed the merits of the bridge, and given what you know yourself about the merits of the bridge, were you surprised to hear him take aim at it?
Yeah, I was. My first reaction was he got bad advice from his advisors and people around him in terms of the facts. Because if you go through the Truth Social post, it talks about how the U.S. should have half the bridge. It talks about, there's no U.S. materials in the bridge. All those things were inaccurate. Actually, I wrote an opinion piece today that was published in the Detroit News that went through and factually corrected those things, because I think it's important to get the president the facts. And so that's what I asked in my piece, was to say, Mr. President, now that you have the facts, I would hope you'd reevaluate this, because if anything, the sooner we open the bridge, it's better for all of us. Michiganders, Americans, Canadians, everybody wins the faster we get this bridge open.
Just in case a clip might make it to somebody who does advise him, in your view, Governor, what are the most important facts to know about this bridge?
Well, I always say thank you to Canada. I've always had a great relationship, and after what happened with the bridge, in terms of Canada financed the entire bridge. So there was no money put up by Michigan or the United States for the actual bridge itself. So we had no obligation, no liability. We will have 50% ownership, the state of Michigan, and the country of Canada will get repaid all its fronted money plus interest, and then we'll be 50-50 partners. That's a fabulous deal for our country and for our state, and we should be very thankful to that. So again, thank you, Canada.
I was just reading moments ago in the New York Times, to your earlier point about who might be advising, for example, the advisors of the president, that the owners of the Ambassador Bridge, which of course you and our viewers will know were vehemently against and have been, as you pointed out in your opinion piece today, for a long time, the construction of this new bridge, met with Howard Lutnick on Monday in Washington. Does that surprise you at all?
Well, that's part of the troubling part of this, is that the Maroons are the only party that benefits from delaying the bridge. They make a lot more money at the expense of Canadian and American consumers and everyone else that would benefit with the new bridge being opened. So it's clear they found someone to talk to. I don't know if it was Lutnick or someone else, but they got someone to go talk to the president and give him bad information. So I appreciate the Prime Minister clarifying that. I'm trying to reinforce the same message as are many other people, and I hope that our president reevaluates the situation and says, this bridge is not the place to have a dispute. Again, if there are trade issues, let's talk about them in a civil fashion and a rational fashion and work through these issues. I can tell you overall, though, Michiganders are very pro-Canada.
Well, I did want to ask you, just sort of based on the current context, when you were negotiating this, when you ultimately decided it was in the best interest of Michigan, the value you saw and perhaps see in a greater level of interconnectedness between Ontario and Michigan, but also Canada and the U.S. vis-a-vis that bridge and the bridges and the border that exists in that area.
Yeah, well, it's always been incredible. One of the favorite things I have every year is going to the International Freedom Festival, where we celebrate with Windsor across the river from Detroit. And one of the most moving things to me every year isn't just the fireworks. During the course of that event, 2 helicopters take each of the country's flags down the river and they play the national anthem. And that's an emotional moment for me. It's really important. And the other fun thing I'll show you, I found this on my bookcase while I was waiting to talk to you. It says, build the bridge, and it goes back to the new international trade crossing. So there's a long history here of saying, Michiganders, I love the Canadians, we all love the Canadians. I joke to people, the only people we have issues with are the people in Ohio.
I know, as you point out, there are other, trade irritants that certainly will come up for discussion. But I wondered your vantage point, which is, again, I think fairly unique, having been the governor of a state that is so closely tied to Canada, on the current state of the relationship. There's been a lot of talk lately, including our Prime Minister, who made a speech a few weeks ago about the perceived permanence of the change in the relationship. And I wondered what you thought about that.
Well, it's clearly a concern, the things that have been going on, but I believe long-term, it's just a wonderful relationship. There will be ups and downs, and we're in a down cycle now. But let's look to the long term. One thing I was proud of is for 6 years, I was chair of the Great Lakes Governors and Premiers Conference. And for all those years, we did wonderful projects with the premiers of Ontario and Quebec and the other states, showing how we could find common ground and doing things together. So let's not forget all the normal day-to-day ongoing things that bind us together in a wonderful way. And the fun part is I had a joke I actually made in the column about, hey, the women hockey teams are playing each other tonight. So we love each other, but I'm going to root for the U.S. to win that. It's hockey now.
I understand the view, but we'll probably take the opposite one here in Canada, as I'm sure you'll understand as well, Governor. Do you ultimately think that those? Yeah. Do you ultimately think the ties that you obviously remember very fondly will supersede the very real fraction, the very real sort of impact that we feel right now of what's going on?
Yeah. Again. We have to respect that there are some differences that need to be addressed. But the dairy issue has been out there for years, the one that the president specifically talked about. Those are things we can work through. Let's not forget, that's one item that I wouldn't put as a major issue on the list compared to all the wonderful things that are happening on an ongoing basis, all the trade that goes on every day, and all the additional trade that would happen if we'd simply get this bridge open and going. So every day that bridge is held up, it's costing American and Canadian consumers more money, making it harder for our businesses. No one wins by this bridge being delayed. Let's get it open. And that's my message to our president.
I'll leave it on that note. Sir, a real pleasure. I appreciate you making the time, Governor.
Thanks.
Thank you. Rick Snyder is the former governor of Michigan. We'll be back with our takeaway after a short break. Welcome back to Power Play. Our takeaway today is all about the spirit of collaboration on Parliament Hill, which appears to be materializing in a very real way. There's no formal agreement, Conservative House Leader Andrew Scheer told us, to stave off an election with the Liberals. But when I did ask him about a particularly contentious piece of legislation prior to Christmas, the Budget Implementation Act, and whether he thinks the Liberals will concede on items the Conservatives have previously identified as red lines of sort, he had this to say.
I believe the conversations are being held in good faith. I find that the last few weeks of meetings that there's been some progress, and that we'll wait and see what actually happens in the end result. But I will say that it seems like the conversations are being held in good faith.
So both the Conservatives and the Liberals over the past 2 weeks essentially saying that these are more than just efforts to collaborate, that there are many pieces of legislation, for example, that they figure that they can advance together, which is definitely a change in posture from even maybe 3 weeks ago when they were not necessarily telling us the exact same thing. I will also let you know that our coverage will continue tonight, of course, for more reaction to Donald Trump's latest threat, where the Gordie Howe Bridge is concerned. That reaction coming throughout the evening here on CTV News Channel. I'm going to leave Power Play there. Thanks very much for watching. I'm Vashti Capellas. I'll see you tomorrow night.